Welcome, everybody. We will go ahead and get started with today's program. So welcome to the National Army Museum and our Civil War Days. We have a multi-day event happening. It began last night with a great virtual presentation of 3 historic Lincoln-related sites. Great discussion, wonderful presentation. You were there as well, yeah? So it was very well received, and so if you participated in that, thank you very much. I thought it went really, really well. Today we have our symposium, which you're all participating. Thank you for registering. We have a great crowd. We also have a great virtual crowd, so welcome to our virtual audience as well. Welcome to today's symposium. The symposium topic is A New Birth of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, exploring Lincoln's role as Commander-in-Chief, his relationships with soldiers, and his transformation of the presidency over the course of the war. Abraham Lincoln saw only a few months of military service in his life. During the Black Hawk War in 1832, he was a volunteer in the militia and saw no combat and very few Indian warriors, nor did he receive any kind of formal military education. Yet he was the commander-in-chief of all United States military forces during the entirety of the 4-year Civil War, which saw the deaths of over 700,000 soldiers in America's most devastating conflict. Lincoln had the character and fortitude to endure many political and military setbacks during the war, beginning with the Union defeat at Bull Run in 1861 and major defeats at the battles of Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Chickamauga. Also Northern draft riots in 1863, and then the grinding attrition warfare of Grant's 1864 overland campaign and the siege of Petersburg. He also faced dangerous political opposition from Northern Copperheads, yet through it all, he persevered as a successful communicator and skillful political leader. He came to see the need to destroy rebel armies, not just to win a battle and let the enemy escape. He soon recognized the importance of bringing maximum pressure to bear on Confederate forces. And Lincoln endured and managed several difficult, if not downright hostile, generals, journalists, and politicians, such as McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, Greeley, and Seward. Lincoln showed flexibility in leading the country's war to crush the Southern Rebellion. He changed his war aim regarding slavery from initially opposing the spread of the institution to favoring abolition as a military measure to attack the Confederacy's ability to wage war. From the Emancipation Proclamation to the enlistment of tens of thousands of Black Americans into Union forces, Lincoln's initiatives proved decisive in assuring the nation's victory, the North's victory. Lincoln's steadfastness during 4 long years of tragic conflict was based on his belief that the probability that we may fail in the struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause we believe to be just. Lincoln and the Union did not fail, of course, but instead brought to the country and its people a new birth of freedom. With that, welcome to today's symposium. We've got a wonderful lineup of speakers, and to start that off, I'm going to introduce John Moss from our Programs and Education Division to begin the introductions. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Tammy, for your remarks and also for supporting us throughout this whole planning process and other programs and events that we put on every year. Before I introduce our first speaker, who will talk about before Grant, the War in the East, 1862 to 1863, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today and for our virtual audience as well. So anything we can do to make your experience here better during the day, let us know. Information, and hopefully if you haven't seen our exhibits and other aspects of the museum, that you'll do that as well. So prior to coming to work for the Army History Program, I taught briefly history at Ohio State, and thank you, sir. The students that I taught, you may not be surprised, they weren't that interested in history, right? But they were very polite, and they had to be there. And so to try to get them more interested, or at least to pay attention, I would often start out my lecture with a trivia question. And if they answered that correctly, then I would bump up their their exam grade half a letter grade, okay? So the demographics in here today is slightly different than my students were at Ohio State, but I'm going to give you the trivia question, okay? So the question is, why were most of the Civil War battles fought inside national parks? Okay? Now, if you know it, don't blurt it out, okay? Because there's some other people trying to come up with that, the answer there. So anyway, thank you very much for being here. Let me introduce our first speaker, Daniel T. Davis. Dan is a senior education manager for the American Battlefield Trust and the author of The Most Desperate Acts of Gallantry, George Armstrong Custer in the Civil War. Dan also co-authored a forthcoming book, Stay and Fight It Out, The Second Day at Gettysburg, July 2nd, 1863, Culp's Hill and the North End of the Battlefield. So that's coming out shortly. We'll look forward to that. He is the co-managing editor of the Emerging Civil War book series and has written articles for both Blue and Gray magazine and the Civil War Times. So let's all welcome Dan Davis.
All right, good morning, everyone. Lead-off speaker, so be sure to have your coffee. I know I've had several cups already, including on the drive up from Fredericksburg earlier this morning. Thank you to John, thank you to Tammy for having me out this morning to speak with you all. It's always great to get out, whether you're in the battlefield, you're in an indoor classroom environment like we are, to talk about subjects that we are all extremely passionate for. Now, the period that we're going to talk about this morning is roughly November 1862, really up until the first couple weeks of March of 1864. And I think it's a very fascinating period of the Civil War within the context of the Eastern Theater, but even more so going down one level below that within the context and examining Abraham Lincoln's interactions and his relationships with the commanders of his principal army, the Army of the Potomac. Now, each of those relationships are going to be different in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, you have different individuals, different commanders, different styles of leadership. But what is going to happen through the course of those roughly year and some change, again, November 62 to March of 64, is Lincoln's leadership is going to evolve. He's always going to be involved in formulating strategy, working with his commanders to formulate strategy, no matter if you are Ambrose Burnside, George Meade, Joseph Hooker. But the relationship that Lincoln, I think, has with these commanders is born out of experience, an experience that goes all the way back, and where we're going to start our story, in fact, in July of 1861. Following the Battle of First Manassas, the Union defeat, Lincoln is going to appoint the fellow up there on the right, Major General George B. McClellan, to command the Army of the Potomac. McClellan is from the very famous class of 1846 at West Point. He's a veteran of the war with Mexico. But what McClellan is even more so is he's an excellent administrator. He's an excellent organizer. He has a very firm grasp on logistics. And McClellan is going to be thrust into a situation not unlike Joseph Hooker, who I'll talk about in just a few minutes. He's going to be thrust into a situation not only to rebuild the army that had fought at First Manassas, but to build a citizen army in Washington. And he's probably the best choice to do that. Again, highly competent as far as an organizer, highly competent as far as being an administrator. But the one thing that McClellan, I think, to a certain degree lacks is that he loves his army too much. He loves his men too much, and that love is reciprocated from the ranks. And what Lincoln is going to find, and what many of McClellan's officers are going to find, is that he has this inability to commit his men to the fight, commit his men to battle for whatever reason. Again, he loves his army. The Army of the Potomac was his child. It was his creation. And Lincoln's going to find out really in the fall of 61 and into the early months of 1862 that he is going to have to take a firmer control, a firmer grasp over the direction that the Army of the Potomac takes in Virginia. Because he recognizes that McClellan is just hesitant, really, to move against the Confederates at Centerville, Manassas under Joseph Johnston. And so Lincoln and McClellan really begin, I think, this sort of dance in their relationship. And I think it's a dance that neither is going to lead, but is going to frustrate Lincoln as the war goes along and you get deeper into 1861 and then into 1862. Lincoln will come up with an idea. McClellan will shoot it down. Lincoln will come up with another idea. McClellan will counter. And I think by the spring of 1862, when McClellan finally does get his men on the move, moves the Army of the Potomac out of Washington, down the Chesapeake Bay, lands at Fort Monroe to move up the Yorktown Peninsula or the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond, I think Lincoln's nerves are frayed and he is beginning to lose patience, I think, with George McClellan. Now, McClellan's going to move up the Yorktown Peninsula, lay siege to a Confederate force at Yorktown in April, May of 1862, and he's going to advance to the gates, literally the gates of Richmond. He's going to be at Mechanicsville when the new Army commander, Confederate commander Robert E. Lee is going to launch an offensive. And that offensive is going to drive McClellan from the gates of Richmond around Mechanicsville all the way back to Harrison's Landing on the James River, what we know today as the 7 Days Battles of the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan sort of guises this Confederate offensive under the idea that he conducts a fighting retreat, pulling all the way back from Richmond to the James Landing. And this, I think, to a great degree, infuriates Lincoln to the point that McClellan was on the precipice of victory, potentially marching into the Confederate capital. But he loses the initiative, and he is driven back and now in a defensive position on the James River. And that's going to cause Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck to start to pull troops away from McClellan's army and send them north, be commanded by the fellow on the left-hand side up there, John Pope. John Pope's a little bit more different than McClellan. Again, he's West Pointer like McClellan, but Pope is riding a wave of success from the Western Theater at Island Number 10 and at Corinth. And Pope is given sort of a similar role that McClellan is going to have in organizing the various Union troops that have been in the Shenandoah Valley, in Northern Virginia, in Central Virginia in the spring and summer of 1862, and cobbling them into what Pope is going to name the Army of Virginia. Pope is bombastic, he's arrogant, he wants to fight, seemingly unlike George McClellan. But like McClellan, Pope is also going to get on the wrong side of Robert E. Lee, and he is going to meet defeat in August of 1862 at Second Manassas. I think Pope and Lincoln had a bit of a different relationship than he did with McClellan. Pope actually begins his offensive into Central Virginia in July, August of 1862 with the objective of capturing the railhead at Gordonsville. Pope is showing initiative, something that McClellan never really showed unless completely prodded by Abraham Lincoln and General-in-Chief Halleck. After the Battle of Cedar Mountain, August of 1862, Pope is going to withdraw back toward Northern Virginia, where he's going to meet defeat on the old Manassas battlefield at Second Manassas at the end of 1862, essentially placing George McClellan back into command. McClellan will follow Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland, engage them along Antietam Creek in September of 1862, only to have, as far as Lincoln is concerned, the Army of Northern Virginia slip away. Even more so, McClellan, and this is going to be interesting when we get a little bit farther along, McClellan did not commit his entire army to the battle at Antietam. That's something that's going to stick in Lincoln's mind, something that he's going to remember in the coming months. McClellan's going to pursue Robert E. Lee back into Virginia, but it seems like Lincoln and McClellan have engaged in the same dance that they had earlier in the year. Lincoln puts forth a plan. McClellan counters. No, we can't do that. That's not feasible. I don't have enough men. Most famously, McClellan will blame the lack of horses in his cavalry, the broken down elements of his cavalry arm, for his lack of maneuver. And that's about the time that Lincoln has had enough. And he is going to replace George McClellan with Ambrose Burnside. I'll pull Burnside's image up here in just a moment. But Lincoln's going to do it at a very critical time in his presidency. He's going to change, again, the commander of his principal army right after the Battle of Antietam, right after he has put forward the preliminary or announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation will state that all slaves then held in bondage as of January 1st, 1863, and those states still in rebellion against the United States shall be made free. It's a very strong political document, a political document that has been analyzed and dissected since it was issued nearly over 160 years ago. But what that political document needs is it needs a victory to give it teeth, to give it support. And for that victory, Lincoln, and this is Lincoln and his cabinet discussing and Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's going to turn to Ambrose Burnside. Now, Burnside, let's look at Burnside outside of December 13th, 1862. We're in November of 1862. The Battle of Fredericksburg is yet to happen. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Lincoln is going to appoint Ambrose Burnside to command the Army of the Potomac. However, Burnside, despite his success in North Carolina, despite his field command of the Ninth Corps, is going to come back to Lincoln and General Halleck and tell Lincoln that he does not seem like he's fit for command. He feels that his abilities are better at the lower level, the corps level, as opposed to an army level. And if you're Abraham Lincoln, you're turning to this man to give you a victory. I can only imagine what was going through Lincoln's mind when he is reading through these letters from Burnside and also meeting with Ambrose Burnside to come up with a plan for Burnside to capture Richmond, launch a winter campaign, and give Lincoln that victory he so sorely needs by January 1st of 1863. So Burnside does in fact come up with a plan. He's got to get to Richmond. His army is roughly in the area around Warrenton. Burnside's going to look off to the south, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. It's an older rail line, probably not going to be able to support his army as it moves south. So then he decides to look to the east, the newer line, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. And Burnside decides he's going to move his army from Warrenton to Fredericksburg, cross the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, and utilize that railroad all the way down to Richmond. At the same time, utilizing the various rivers that move or that emulate up into Virginia to supply his army with the support of the Union Navy. But this is another great debate about the Fredericksburg campaign. Bureaucratic issues in the War Department lend itself to the fact that the pontoons that Burnside so desperately needs to get to Fredericksburg do not arrive on time. They do not arrive when Burnside's army gets to Fredericksburg middle of November of 1862. Burnside, to his credit, gets his army moving pretty quickly, and he actually steals a march on Robert E. Lee. But by the time that the pontoons are available, they arrive. It's too late. Lee is moved from the area around Culpeper, Stonewall Jackson, eventually from the Shenandoah Valley to block Burnside's route south. And within a week of the Confederates blocking Burnside's route south, Lincoln himself, again, taking a more of a firmer control of the war and of strategic planning, is going to make his way from Washington down to meet with Burnside on November the 26th. And Lincoln's going to put forth a plan to move troops to Port Royal, which is just off, actually, it's at the very bottom right center of the map. Move troops to Port Royal and then move troops to the Pamunkey River, get them across those rivers, flank Lee out of Fredericksburg, and then move on either to the south to assail Richmond or move north to engage Lee as Burnside is coming across the Rappahannock in Lee's front. Burnside, Lincoln, they discuss it, but Burnside, like McClellan, is going to counter, as will General-in-Chief Halleck. They don't believe that this plan is feasible. going to take too long to move the troops along the rivers with the support of the Union Navy to get to those locations in time before the 1st of January. So then Burnside, Lincoln, for his part, I believe, was probably a little upset when he moved back to Washington, went back to Washington after that conference. Burnside's finally going to get across the Rappahannock, however, on December the 11th. He looks upstream, decides not to cross upstream, looks downstream, decides not to cross downstream. He decides to cross in the front of and through the city of Fredericksburg itself. December the 11th, it's going to engage, the Union Army is going to engage with the artillery and eventually infantry, Confederates in the city. Those Confederates are going to hold up the bridge building by the pontooniers for the better part of the day on December the 11th, and they will withdraw and abandon the city to Burnside and his army that night. On December the 12th, Burnside is going to formulate a battle plan. He's going to attack Lee at the southern end of the field, or Lee's right flank at Prospect Hill, held by Stonewall Jackson, and he's going to send in troops through the city and the streets of the city to attack Confederates who are positioned along Marie's Heights just west of the town. Early in the morning of December the 13th, Union attacks will begin in this area here. This is a slaughter pen farm. If you are a member of the American Battlefield Trust, this land belongs to you. This has been preserved by the trust. There's going to be heavy fighting through the course of the morning and into the early afternoon hours across these fields south of the city. But the slaughter pen farm, the fighting there is going to be overshadowed by what takes place in the city itself. And that is wave after wave, division of Union troops filing out of the city to attack Lee's position here along a sunken road at the base of Marie's Heights that's defended by Confederate infantry with guns, Confederate artillery on the heights behind them to support the infantry in the road. By the end of the day, 8,000 Union soldiers will fall in front of the stone wall in Marie's Heights. That is more men that Pickett will lose at Gettysburg on July 3rd, more men than Ulysses S. Grant will lose on June 1st and June 3rd during the assaults at Cold Harbor, and more men than John Bell Hood will lose at Franklin in November of 1864. It is the most costliest frontal attack of the Civil War. Burnside the next day, somewhat to his credit, wants to renew the assaults, but his subordinates talk him out of it. But one thing I will say about Ambrose Burnside, and what's different from Burnside and George McClellan, and I think something that Lincoln probably found refreshing, is that Burnside takes full responsibility for the disaster at Fredericksburg. He's actually going to write a letter to the Northern press that will be published in the Northern newspapers, absolving his subordinates of the battle and taking full blame and responsibility himself. But that's not enough, because there is dissension growing in the ranks, there's dissension growing in the officer corps. And in fact, late in December, two of Burnside's subordinates, John Newton and John Cochran, are going to travel to Washington, D.C. Now, these are Union officers under Burnside who go to the White House to meet with Lincoln and tell Lincoln about not only what a disaster Burnside is as a commander, but the overall condition of the Army. We know rock bottom being at the very bottom. Well, the morale of the Army of the Potomac had shot right through rock bottom. The Army of the Potomac is in really bad shape after Fredericksburg. Now, I can only imagine Abraham Lincoln sitting there and having two of my generals come in to my office and tell me how bad one of my Army commanders is. Lincoln, though, being the consummate politician that he is, he's going to let it go. But again, taking control, firm control over the strategic situation and strategic planning, he's going to send a note to Burnside and tell Burnside that any future plans that you may formulate, they need to come through me first, and I will approve them. The next plan that Burnside comes up with in an attempt to salvage the situation at Fredericksburg is depicted here in the sketch by Alfred Wood, what we know today as the Mud March. Ambrose Burnside decides that he's going to march up the Rappahannock, cross the various fords beyond Lee's left flank, and then flank Lee out of Fredericksburg. But Mother Nature is going to intervene, and the skies are going to open up, and Burnside and his army are literally going to be stuck in the mud. And that's going to be pretty much it for Ambrose Burnside. He's going to, again, taking full responsibility for what has happened during the campaign. He's going to submit his resignation as Army commander. He will revert back to command of his old Ninth Corps, but he will resign from the command of the Army of the Potomac. And in his place, Abraham Lincoln will put this fellow, Joseph Hooker. Joseph Hooker, again, let's look at Joseph Hooker before the Chancellorsville campaign, like we did with Ambrose Burnside before Fredericksburg. Hooker is an accomplished division commander in the Army of the Potomac. He's different than McClellan. He's very aggressive. He wants to put his men into the fight. He wants to commit to battle. He's, again, very aggressive commander. But he's also an intriguer. He's not outside the realm of ingratiating himself to his superiors, especially his superiors, his civilian superiors in Congress. In fact, in one of the first letters that Lincoln is going to write to Hooker, he's going to respond to rumors that Hooker had made some statements regarding the military and having a dictatorship. Hooker recognizes the situation that the nation is experiencing at that time after Fredericksburg and with the Emancipation Proclamation becoming law on the 1st of January. The nation is in dire straits. And Lincoln famously write back to Hooker words to the effect that, I've heard that you said that the military and the government need a dictator. I wish you all the military success, and I will risk the dictatorship, which I think is an interesting turn of phrase by Lincoln, because he's keeping Hooker in his place. He knows that Hooker's very ambitious, knows that Hooker is prone to intrigue. He's keeping Hooker as the Army commander, saying, you command the Army, and I will deal with the politics. Hooker, like his predecessor, George McClellan, is going to be faced with the monumental task of rebuilding the Army of the Potomac after the 1862 campaigns and after Fredericksburg, and getting them back into fighting trim by the time the time for the spring campaign rolls around. And to his credit, I think Hooker does a pretty good job. He reorganizes his cavalry. He improves the rations that are issued to the men. He institutes a system of corps badges to help build back the esprit de corps in the Army. And he also, I think, much to the popularity of the soldiers in the ranks, he incorporates a system of furloughs, allowing the men to go home. Some of those men had not seen home in the better part of 2 years. And Hooker is also, and I think Lincoln probably finds this somewhat refreshing after having dealt with George McClellan and after having dealt with Ambrose Burnside. Hooker lets Lincoln speak his mind. He doesn't come back with a counterargument. He doesn't come back, well, this is not feasible. We should not try this. This is too risky. Hooker and Lincoln, through the early months of 1863, they begin to establish, I think, a very good working relationship. And there's a free exchange of ideas. And I think that, in fact, there's some accounts from when Lincoln visits the Army in April of 1863 from a newspaperman that he observed Lincoln being very much at ease when meeting and talking and discussing plans with Hooker. But going back to Antietam, Lincoln remembers that McClellan had not put all his men in the field. And Lincoln is going to remind Joseph Hooker that in the next battle, commit all of your men to the engagement. Hooker is going to come up with a plan, not so different than the one that Ambrose Burnside had come up, which ended in the failure of the March. March up the Rappahannock River, cross the various fords, flank Lee out of Fredericksburg. He does not want to repeat, again, Burnside's mistake of attacking Lee head on. But in a monumental piece of generalship, from April 27th to May 6, 1863, Robert E. Lee, outnumbered roughly about 2-1, is going to divide his army 3 times, and he is going to defeat Joseph Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville, known as Lee's greatest victory. Lee has just had two incredible victories in the East over the Army of the Potomac. And a campaign that began with so much promise, if you're Joseph Hooker, ended again in complete disaster. Lincoln was heard to say when he received the news at Chancellorsville, my God, what will the country say?" But Lincoln's going to stick with Hooker just a little while longer. Lee is riding that wave of momentum, following Fredericksburg, following Chancellorsville, and he sets in motion a plan to launch a second northern invasion. She does beginning on June 3rd, pulling out of Fredericksburg, moving westward toward the Shenandoah Valley, down the valley into Maryland and Pennsylvania. And I think to Hooker's credit, what is lost in those first few weeks of June of 1863 is that Hooker's going to do a pretty good job, I think, of getting his army out of the Fredericksburg area, countering Lee's movement, marching north to shadow Washington, but also in sending his cavalry out to probe Lee's positions, resulting in the battles of Brandy Station, fights at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. Hooker, what I find rather interesting is that Hooker is going to reorganize his army to a certain degree into various wings that his successor, George Meade, is going to keep when Meade ascends to command. And I'll talk a little bit more about Meade in just a few minutes. But the fallout from Chancellorsville, the poor relationships that Hooker has, the enemies that he's made inside the administration are not enough to save him. And he's going to eventually be removed at the end of June and George Meade is going to be replacing Joseph Hooker. Now, it's interesting as far as Meade is concerned. And I say that because, for one, Meade had been approached by his subordinates or fellow officers after Chancellorsville. Meade is one of a number of Union officers who is just becomes completely flabbergasted, upset by Hooker's actions at Chancellorsville. And Meade is going to be approached as to whether or not he would want command of the Army of the Potomac. And Meade, to his credit, I think, in showing a little bit of political maneuvering himself, says that he will not publicly condemn Joseph Hooker, but at the same time, if he was asked so privately, he would ask for Hooker to be removed. But Meade is going to receive command toward the end of June of 1863. This is a relationship, I think, that is probably the most dynamic that Lincoln is going to have before Ulysses S. Grant ascends to general-in-chief. And I say that because I think Burnside and Lincoln enjoyed a pretty good working relationship. Again, Lincoln found it refreshing. He found a really good relationship and a partner in Joseph Hooker. Meade's the most interesting one of them all, because in George Meade, Lincoln is not going to act to a certain degree as a superior. He is not going to nurture that relationship. Lincoln is going to, I think, be detrimental to Meade's relationship, and I'll explain that in just a moment. We know very famously, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, George Meade is going to do something that none of his predecessors have done yet in the Eastern Theater. He's going to defeat Robert E. Lee on the field of battle. But what does he get from Lincoln? He doesn't get praise. He receives criticism. Lincoln recognizes the opportunity, or potentially the opportunity, of Gettysburg. He doesn't want to repeat what happened after Antietam with McClellan letting Lee march back into Virginia. Meade is being prodded by Lincoln to pursue Robert E. Lee and destroy the Army of Northern Virginia before they can cross the Potomac into the safety of Virginia. But I would counter that, and I would say, what does Meade have to pursue with? He's just sustained 23,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting. 3 of his corps commanders are out of action, including the one that he relied upon the most during the campaign, Winfield Scott Hancock. And moreover, the weather turns exceptionally poor July 4th, July 5th, of 1863 when the heavens open up and the rains come down. It's interesting reading the writings, the exchanges between Meade and Lincoln during this period. Because if you're George Meade, you're coming off of victory. But at the same time, you're trying to regroup. You're trying to deal with the situation in front of you. And then you have the commander-in-chief, after you've earned this victory, writing you and telling you that you had an opportunity to end the war, but because of you, the war will now go on indefinitely. If you're George Meade, how do you feel? I think Lincoln, in this particular instance, probably overstepped and probably should have done a better job again of nurturing and really acting as a motivation for Meade to keep Meade going. Meade and Lee are going to return to Virginia. Meade's going to score another victory over Robert E. Lee in October of 1863 at the Battle of Bristow Station. And then he's going to do something else that had not been done before. Over the course of the last year or so, the Rappahannock River had served as really the dividing line, the defensive line for Robert E. Lee. But on November 7th, the battles of Rappahannock Station, Second Kelly's Ford, Meade's going to drive Lee away from the Army of the Potomac, from the Rappahannock. He's going to push Lee below the Rapidan into Orange County. He's removed that defensive barrier, and he's pushed Lee farther back toward Richmond. Meade is going to follow Lee. Lee is going to take up a position in Orange County along the banks of a creek known as Mine Run. Meade has every intention of attacking Lee at the end of November of 1863 at Mine Run. But after issuing the orders, after his subordinates conduct various reconnaissances of the lines, Meade is going to call off the attack. His famous staff officer, Theodore Lyman, is going to write that it took great moral courage for Meade not to attack Lee head on at Mine Run. But the one officer that Meade was hoping that would come through for him that morning is Gouverneur Warren. And Meade is said to have exclaimed to Warren in an exchange after the attack was called off, "Warren, you have ruined me." Meade knows that the criticism that he has been facing from Lincoln over the course of the last several months, it's only going to be ratcheted up even higher. And as he will ride to his winter headquarters at Brandy Station in Culpeper County, Meade is going to be heard to say that his withdrawal from Mine Run is going to make them howl in Washington. Meade is going to spend the winter on really the old Brandy Station battlefield. His headquarters is going to be at Brandy Station. And he's going to spend his time between administrative work, attending balls and galas in camp. But he's also going to be moving from Brandy Station to Washington to testify before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War for his conduct over the course of the last 6, 7, 8 months, going back to Gettysburg. And you have to wonder, if you really do, in my estimation, is Meade coming under all that criticism if Lincoln, instead of being critical himself after Gettysburg, had come out and made a public show of support for George Gordon Meade? There is some rumblings in Washington, in the Army of the Potomac, that Meade's going to be relieved of command. Meade, in fact, writes to his wife, though, that it would be foolish to remove him from command at that point in time. Meade is going to he's not going to be relieved of command, but he's going to suffer for being put under the thumb, I think, of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, through the course of the war, the one constant that Lincoln will have as he goes through the many commanders, east and west, is this individual, Ulysses S. Grant. From his victories at Fort Henry and Donelson to Shiloh to Corinth to Vicksburg to Chattanooga, Grant has been the one constant that Lincoln has. And he is the constant of success. He is the one general who has achieved success in either theater on a consistent basis. And for this, in March of 1864, Grant is going to be appointed to be Lieutenant General and General-in-Chief of all the Union armies. In fact, when he meets with Lincoln for the first time in the White House after receiving his appointment, Lincoln, interestingly enough, is going to remove himself from the strategic situation. He tells Grant, I do not want to know your plans. He's going to allow Grant to execute the war, really out of necessity. Lincoln is facing an election year. He knows that the fate of the war, the fate of the Union is riding on what happens in November. So what does Lincoln do? He takes a calculated risk. He puts all his chips on the table, and he turns to the one person that has had success up until this point in time in the war. And he's going to allow Grant to execute his own strategy, not Henry Halleck's strategy, not his own strategy, but Grant's strategy. From the Red River to the Chesapeake, for the first time in May of 1864, Grant is going to execute a strategy where all Union armies are going to be moving at the same time against the Confederates. Grant is going to make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, with George Meade. Meade, who had been an Army commander, who had had his success at Gettysburg, had his success at Rappahannock Station, Kelly's Ford, Bristow Station, is now going to be relegated to the back burner. It will no longer be George Meade's army. It will be Ulysses S. Grant's army. Grant will direct it. Meade sort of, unfortunately for him, along for the ride. That ride begins for Grant and Meade on May 4th, 1864, when they leave Meade's headquarters at Brandy Station, move across the Rapidan River. The fighting starts the following day in the wilderness. From the wilderness, Spotsylvania, to the North Anna River, to Cold Harbor, once again back to the gates of Richmond and Petersburg. Grant is going to execute his strategy until April 9th of 1865, when Robert E. Lee finally capitulates at Appomattox Courthouse. Again, thank you all for coming out this morning. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Good morning, Keith June. Great presentation. Just one question with reference to how did we being Congress, the nation, look at the position of commander-in-chief? And how did that change during the course of the Civil War? I mean, today this would require, for the commander to be congressional approval. I get the impression Lincoln was able to do that within his own authority, but also you see Congress sort of intervening as well, and just sort of how did position of commander-in-chief transform during this period?
That's a great question. I think first and foremost, the country is dealing with a situation that we had not dealt with since the ratification of the Constitution. That was Civil War. So it's a unique position for Lincoln. It's a unique position also for Congress. And I think Lincoln as commander-in-chief, and we can look at this and compare him to his own predecessors. He takes more control over the strategic situation, both in the Eastern Theater and in the Western Theater. He is a commander-in-chief, he is a civilian leader, but he's taken a stronger role in the direction of the military, which is, say, different from a James Polk, from a James Madison, war with Mexico, the War of 1812, respectively. At the same time, there are those checks that we have. I mentioned the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, committee set up by Congress to investigate the armies for conduct of the officers and the conduct of their campaigns. But again, also Congress is still dealing with, Senate is still dealing with appointments. Lincoln can appoint a commander. Senate it has to be approved by Congress, similar to Grant's, or just like Grant's appointment to Lieutenant General, a rank that had not been in service since the days of George Washington. So Lincoln can still make the nominations, but they also have to be approved by Congress.
Hi, would you talk a little more about the decision that Meade made at Mine Run to not go forward with an attack? Was there a council of war and some of the debate around there?
Yes, absolutely. So again, George Meade pursues Robert E. Lee into Orange County across the Rapidan River. Lee sets up and entrenches along Mine Run. Meade has plans to attack the Confederates for November 29th, November 30th of 1863. Meade does hold a council of war with his corps commanders. He does meet with his corps commanders. He is told during this council of war by Governor Warren, who will be leading the offensive, the main effort, that he will be able to make the attack the next morning, as planned. Meade is sitting at his headquarters the next morning as Warren, unbeknownst to him, has gone out in front of the lines, and he has reconnoitered the Confederate position, found the Confederate position to be extremely strong. Remember, Governor Warren's an engineer. He's not really a combat commander. George Meade's an engineer, not a combat commander. Or rather, he is, but he's a trained engineer. He recognizes, Warren and Meade, how strong the Confederate defenses are. And again, Meade has been at Fredericksburg. Meade does not want to dash his army up against those entrenchments. So there are also, going back to the Council of War the night before, there are a number of messages that are exchanged between Meade and Governor Warren, Meade and John Sedgwick, 6th Corps commander, and eventually Meade is going to ride out to Warren's position. He's going to assess the situation, and he's going to back Warren up and make the decision to call off the attack. So there is a number of, and throughout the course of those several days at the end of November, Meade is in constant contact with his subordinates.
My question involves, as you looked at this period in history, most of the focus on what's happening goes to Gettysburg. But if you look at the entire period, what leadership style do you see prevalent on both sides? You have generals on both sides with different leadership styles. Have you identified one that seemed to be prevailing?
I don't think that there's one that's prevailing. I think there's a combination of several. One, determination, being aggressive, but also being somewhat innovative. And I see that in individuals like Grant. I see that in individuals like William Tecumseh Sherman.
Do you see much toxic leadership during this period?
I see toxic leadership, absolutely. It starts with the first two individuals we talked about, George McClellan and John Pope. McClellan is a very toxic individual from the perspective just that he has his own ideas about how the war should be prosecuted that are different from that of the commander-in-chief. When you have two leaders at a very high level that are at loggerheads, you're never going to be able to find success. Joseph Hooker, you could probably make the argument that Joseph Hooker is a toxic individual. One individual I did not talk about, but was incredibly toxic with me, was Daniel Sickles. So yes, there's a combination of both, but I think fortunately for the Army, fortunately for the nation, those that were able to achieve victory in the end, those are the ones that were able to prevail through the course of the war despite having various ups and downs.
So something that came to mind with me with Hooker, and it's interesting, I was doing some study on Antietam, and in both Chancellorsville and Antietam, Hooker is basically concussed by artillery. Can you maybe discuss like any changes in like the Battle of Chancellorsville that Hooker's concussion may play a part in that really changes the battle and probably ultimately leads to his demise as commander of the Army?
That's a great question. On the afternoon of May 3rd, 1863, as Lee's wings are closing in on the Chancellorsville crossroads, a shell fire from Confederate artillery position at Hazel Grove is going to strike the pillar that Hooker's standing next to. And he's going to be concussed, or he's going to be dazed. And it leads to Hooker issuing a set of very confusing orders. He's going to tell his second-in-command, Darius Couch, or his subordinates, to stay on the field, continue fighting, maintain your position. But then again, in the very same breath, he's going to say, we need to disengage and withdraw to a new position closer to the Rappahannock. Does it impact Hooker's battlefield decisions? Absolutely. At the same time, does it have any impact on that battle? It could have. I say that because over the course of the last several hours, in fact, May 3rd at Chancellorsville and then at Salem Church is going to end up being one of the bloodiest days of the Civil War. The Union Army is holding its own against Lee's assaults. Lee has the artillery position. He has the advantage, the high ground at Hazel Grove with the artillery platform. However, the Union Army is continuing to put up a very stiff fight. Had they stayed, it may have been interesting to see how the situation would have played out at Chancellorsville. As far as being removed from Army Command, Hooker again is he's fighting the Army of Northern Virginia, but he's also fighting Congress. He's also fighting, more specifically, General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. Halleck and Hooker go back to the pre-war days in California, where Hooker, the inveterate gambler, lost a fair sum of money to Henry Halleck and has never paid them back that debt. And that debt goes back about at least a decade, or if not more. Halleck is not an easy forgiver, and he remembers that. And I think to a certain degree, Henry Halleck, and this goes back to some toxic leadership, Halleck uses the old grudge as a vehicle in to remove Joseph Hooker eventually, or recommend his removal from command.
After the Battle of the Wilderness, Grant makes the decision to pursue Lee in Spotsylvania. Would you talk a little bit about the effect that had on the Union Army and the subsequent battles under Grant?
I think that what you just mentioned, that moment in the wilderness when Grant makes that decision, I think that is probably your true turning point of the war in Virginia. It's not Gettysburg. Gettysburg, Lee's army is still intact. You have to look at it from Grant's perspective as well as from Lincoln's. Again, it's an election year. You have a new commander in the East in Ulysses S. Grant. He's had all this success in the Western Theater. He comes to the East. And in 2 days of fighting, he is fought to a stalemate by Robert E. Lee. This is just perceptively another commander who has been recycled through, who cannot defeat Robert E. Lee. But Grant also recognizes again that the success of his armies, particularly the Army of the Potomac, is going to weigh heavily months down the road in November when the Northern people go to the polls. A defeat in Virginia is going to be, again, is going to be catastrophic for not only Grant, but Lincoln, the war effort, and perhaps the nation. So Grant makes that decision, again, after being defeated, another commander being defeated by Lee. He decides after the Wilderness, he will not retreat. And he famously says that there will be no turning back. He sends that message back through the lines to President Lincoln. And I think that spirit of determination, and we know from the accounts of the Union soldiers on the night march to Spotsylvania Courthouse that they cheered Grant and Meade and their escorts as they rode south along the Brock Road, eventually toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. And from Grant's perspective, it sends a message to the men in the ranks that we have started this campaign. We will see it through. We will end this the right way. And that's something that they really had not had from any other commander up until that point in time. And that's, again, that spirit of determination on the part of Grant. I think it's one of the most important moments, if not the most important moment of the entire 4 years of the Civil War.
Here. No. Oh, apropos the earlier question about Chancellorsville, one of the great what-ifs of the Civil War is the word Darius Couch.
Mm-hmm.
What were the procedures? Were there any formal procedures when Hooker was hit in the head? He was out. Darius Couch was his number two. Oddly, for the Civil War, Hooker had briefed Couch entirely. Couch knew this whole system. Couch, like almost every other general, said, "We're holding our own. We've got a huge wave. This is the time." That Darius Couch did not do what he, well, in retrospect, would have changed the war. But that's Darius Couch. But what were there any formal procedures, agreements, other than a consensus? The general is, what were the rules?
Darius Couch, not so much being a consensus, would assume command of the Army of the Potomac, which he does rather briefly through the course of maybe 24 to 48 hours. But he's still under the direction of Joseph Hooker. What's interesting about comment is you have to look forward to the night of May 5th and May 6th, where Joseph Hooker is going to call a council of war, and he is going to poll his commanders. Do we stay on the south bank of the Rappahannock and fight, or do we retreat? Hooker is going to leave the room. The commanders are going to vote. The majority votes to stay and fight. Hooker comes back into the room, receives the news, and he says, no, we're going to withdraw. So there is, to a certain degree, yes, there was some, Couch did exercise operational control very shortly, but when you get to the procedures, the councils of war, which is a very interesting council of war into and of itself, because Hooker, before he left the room, had told his subordinates that he was going to act on the decision that they made.
So we have a few questions from Zoom that I'm just going to combine into one. So did Lincoln ever meet personally with Robert E. Lee? Was Lee offered command of the Union Army? And what was Lincoln's relationship with Confederate generals like?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. There has been much made about Lincoln offering command through an intermediary. I believe it was Francis P. Blair or Winfield Scott offering Lee command of the Union armies at the outset of the war. There may be some truth to that. I know it's been debated by historians through the course of time. Lee is a top officer in the U.S. Army. He has a stellar career from his time that he graduated at West Point all the way up until 1861. Would he have been someone considered for a higher position? Absolutely. Did Lincoln formally meet with him and formally offer him command? I don't believe so. Lincoln's relationship, and I'm racking my brain, and I'll throw it out to the attendees. I'm not sure that there is a moment where he actually meets with a Confederate general in the White House or a member of the Confederate military. I don't. That being said, his relationship was one that he had, I think he had mentioned in his second inaugural address, that he mentioned his attitude toward the Confederacy, but he also mentions it again after the fall of Richmond and Petersburg to Ulysses S. Grant, when he meets with Grant at the outset of the Appomattox campaign, and he tells Grant, let him up easy. I think Lincoln was, while he may not have met with a individual Confederate general or had a relationship with them, I think his attitude toward them was that they are still our countrymen. We need to reconcile with them and bring them back into the United States.
Okay, and another one from Zoom. How did Lincoln's meeting with Winfield Scott at West Point influence Lincoln's decision-making with regard to the conduct of the war and the appointment of Burnside?
Is that with meeting with Winfield Scott?
Yes, Lincoln's meeting with Winfield Scott at West Point.
That one's, I'm going to turn it back to the attendees. That one is escaping me as well. Winfield Scott is going to command the Union armies very briefly, 1861, 1862, comes up with the famous Anaconda Plan, which through the course of the war is executed somewhat successfully by the Union armies before Scott, just because of old age and health, is forced to resign. Lincoln, the interesting thing about Lincoln and Burnside, I think, again, is that you have to look at Burnside outside the scope of 1862, or December 13th, 1862, in the Battle of Fredericksburg. You have to look at what Burnside did up until that point in time, and that he's been a very successful commander in North Carolina and coastal Carolina. Even more so, he's not only been a successful commander, he's been an independent commander. He's been in the field with discretion to think for himself and execute how he sees fit. He's commanded the 9th Corps in the Army of the Potomac. He's the best available choice at that time. The NFL draft is coming up in a few weeks. Hear teams say all the time, take the best available player. Burnside's the best available player. But again, Burnside does not believe that he is the best available. He believes that his talents are better suited for the lower levels of command. And he protests, and he mentions it's not just after he is appointed, but he mentions it through his entire tenure as command from November to January in those 3 months' time. He continues to tell Lincoln and General-in-Chief Halleck that I'm not qualified for this position.
Okay, and one last one from Zoom. Why did Lincoln decide to be hands-off with Grant? Was it because of Grant's success, or did Lincoln realize his hands-on approach wasn't working?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I think even more so, I think it's trust. Lincoln blindly, to a certain degree, trusts Grant. And you see, especially both theaters, after Grant's appointment to be General-in-Chief, you really start to see Lincoln taking more of a backseat approach to the war. He's removing himself from the decision-making. The decision-making is being made by Grant. And he tells Grant this at the outset. Again, I don't want to know your plans, but I will offer whatever support, political support you may need. You just let me know. And it's an interesting dynamic, and you can sort of compare it to how Lincoln is involved in removing McClellan. He's removing Burnside, removing Hooker to a certain degree. But you can punt that out to December of 1864 in Nashville, in the situation facing George Thomas and his command at Nashville and facing John Bell Hood. Thomas is going to launch an attack. He's going to attack Hood at Nashville. He's sending messages to Washington, sending messages to Grant at City Point outside Petersburg of his plans. But Grant, for whatever reason, just continues to get more fed up as the days go along and actually leaves City Point, goes to Washington, and makes preparations to go to Nashville to remove George Thomas from command. It was a bit of luck, a stroke of luck for George Thomas. Telegraph lines are down to Washington. Time the telegraph lines get back up, December 15th, 1864. First day of the Battle of Nashville. Hood has been completely swept out of his initial position in front of Nashville. Following day, Thomas and his men will launch another attack, pushing Hood eventually out of Middle Tennessee. But what you see when you examine this episode is how hands-off and how distant Abraham Lincoln is away from it. He doesn't really have a whole lot of input beyond just directing Grant, do what you see best. And it's Grant who is driving that train to potentially remove, unfortunately, we did not remove George Thomas.
I have two questions. You were talking about the relationship between Meade and Lincoln after Gettysburg. And I just wondered, is that the consensus view of how Lincoln thought about him? Or are there other historians who take a different view? You were saying how he might have been trying to motivate Meade. I mean, tell me.
Lincoln is doing essentially what he had been doing with George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside. He's prodding Meade. I don't know that there's a consensus, but I do feel that historians have come to be a little bit more sympathetic to George Gordon Meade. And I think Lincoln, again, I think that relationship would have been far better in the long term than it was had Lincoln had initially come out in support of Meade, and rather than criticize, be supportive.
Okay.
And I think that worked to Meade's, and I think from there, despite having his subordinates go to Lincoln, Oliver Otis, Howard, commander of the 11th Corps, goes himself to the White House to tell Lincoln what a just great commander Meade is. Like, Meade does not deserve this criticism. But I think from the outset, had Lincoln taken a different approach, I don't think you see the criticism. I don't think you see the examination, that full examination you get with Meade from 63 and into 64 when he's in Washington testifying.
Okay, that was my related question is when did that start in Congress that they set up that committee or?
It is set up in the fall of 1861 by two radical Republicans, Benjamin Wade and Zachariah Chandler, in response to the disaster at the Battle of Ball's Bluff. And the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War is, if you ever have an opportunity to read through their proceedings, it's incredibly fascinating. One of the first things that they do is cashier the Union commander at Ball's Bluff, Charles Stone, and they will serve as really an oversight committee to examine the armies, examine the officers, examine the conduct of the various campaigns throughout the course of the war. If you're being called before the committee, you're not going to have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks to Dan Davis and also to the American Battlefield Trust for supporting him out here today.